The cathedral had been taking a bit of a beating. It wasn't in the manner of the rebels to vacate a defensible stone structure, but I imagine the religious significance of the thing made it impossible for them to abide by the decision to occupy it, and like so many other monuments in Munich, they would be tangentially responsible for its systematic destruction by our artillery. A carriage had brought us to a safe distance, and Father had continually commanded the driver to halt when the pounding of the guns threatened to spook the horses. I had no pity for them since my early youth. Pity for those horses, I mean. Mother's insistence that I learn to ride taught me that they are stubborn creatures, and seemingly filled with an endless torrent of excrement. The coronation was a bit of a mess. 7th Corps was continuing its advance down the outer perimeter of the city, and one could continually hear the cracks of rifles echo against the ancient stone of the cathedral. Grandfather nearly slipped in the smashed glass that littered the floor, and the elder Moltke had been picking grains of stone out of his tunic through most of the process. It was grandiose in some sense. All those daring men in our Prussian blue, chests full of medals from the last decade's victories, shouting and raising swords in honor of our new Kaiser. I felt a strong temptation to sneak out the smashed-in wall and see if the action was near, but thought better of it. Now, at 25, realizations that the political expediency of getting the matter through with seems overshadowed by the suspicion that it prompted. Why rush the matter if our victories were inevitable, ordained by God himself? I was a boy when our nation became an empire, and now, here in this dark and wondrous place beneath the earth, it seems appropriate that I put my thoughts to the written word. This state of the world by which scandal and verbal jousting and jockeying for power amongst the great nations is not a phase, in my view, that will continue forever. It will yield in due time to a storm that might sweep all of us away into the depths of an uncharted ocean. While the peace above permits us a limited time for contemplation, my experience here in the guts of the earth has allowed me to see the lightning and hear the thunder. In this camp, where a young infantry officer by the name of Falkenhayn takes dictation for me, lanterns and campfires serve as the only illumination that flicker like ghosts across great granite crevasses. I will put this story to paper. The men and I both pray that we will be able to disseminate it to those above with our own two hands. I write this for my people, the Germans who now join the powers of the world as an equal. I write this for my son, who in time will be where I am now as a man waiting for a chance on his throne. I write this for my wife, whose patience with me and with the duties that I have been entrusted with has been more than generous. I write this for all of them, and I burn with a wish for them to read it. Ever the prompt, ever the ready. There's an English proverb that my mother once told me. Down to Gehenna or up to the throne he travels fastest who travels alone. I hadn't known the meaning of alone for 20 years. I certainly didn't expect to know it now. I was charged, as the family's ablest man, with a new duty. I recall that day at Charlottenburg when Bismarck's administration had released the tender for the use of their elevator. Father's cough had gotten considerably worse. Those English doctors were always rushing about the place. Ointments and tinctures and innumerable little nasty instruments that one might use to extract a confession from the condemned. I hated them. Even now, their malpractice wrings the life out of father to the extent that he must write notes to the servants and the family to communicate. But mother insisted that father's condition required their presence and that British doctors had done so much good for her family. My desk in the palace had become quite crowded. My colleagues at the academy had continually flipped those silver pennies from our antiquity against the surface and left little dents in the course of the drinking games. Thankfully, there was always sufficient paperwork above to cover them. It was a warm afternoon that summer, and we had left the windows open. I had remembered the nursemaid had just taken little Wilhelm from Dona before the fellow, quite mad, ran in and almost became a casualty of the doorman's bayonet. He handed my adjutant a telegram and then ran right back out at the same speed, and the screams of the household staff indicated to me that he had opened the wrong door at the wrong time. The servants never stole, but opening the doors to their quarters during their state of undress even made my blood run cold at times. Such was their indignation. I unfolded the little paper mystery and read it to myself. Journey down approved. Stop. Krupp and Siemens to match expenses. Stop. Let the boy win his spurs. Stop. Curious. Despite his amusing references to the history of our English cousins, the vague nature of the telegram perturbed me. The movers and shakers in our circles all knew that something was brewing. The legislature had been sequestered in closed-door committees for months. I had heard from an adjutant that Bismarck himself had been subject to so many hours of meetings that he had been seen falling asleep, standing upright in the hallways. It became obvious that an inquiry would need to be made as to what was meant exactly. I don't care for the diplomatic and ass-licking and the metaphor. Reality is what interests me. Destiny seemed to ensure that I would find it eventually. There are few men that I enjoy the company of more than Commander Tirpitz. Despite his rotundity, he is a sprightly fellow, older than me but not by much, and deferential to the royal house almost to a fault. His habit of rousting around with von Spee and the others amongst the admiralty gave him a gift of the gab. If given the opportunity, the man would talk until Judgment Day, and then begin an address to the Saviour. Once it became obvious that my duty to Germany required me to go beneath the earth, he visited Charlottenburg and asked me to accompany him to oversee some naval construction efforts. Eager to escape the chattering quartermasters, I agreed. The train to Kiel was quiet, and we, being men about the crown rather than the town, travelled without escort. Father had always insisted that the royal scion needed to be accompanied on journeys, but the advice had largely become antiquated as our government's policing efforts slowly brought peace to the previously chaotic cities. I will admit I never cared for their methods, sneaking about and surveilling. Peeping Toms are always looking to see what secrets a man might have. It seemed appalling, the backbiting and lying that became their trademark. If, in 100 years, this work is still published, I contend that we ought to convince our opponents, within and without, with the weapon of truth before the other weapons are deployed. It became obvious that Tirpitz had lied to me on the train. When asked about what exactly I was there to see, he slapped my intelligence with vague notions and descriptions. After a visit to the dining car and retiring to our cabin with some Cabernet, halfway through the third bottle, he finally said something worth hearing.
Something, my prince, that you should see before your journey begins.
Now I was intrigued. We arrived in Kiel the following morning, a bustling town now made rich with the products of a burgeoning empire. His insistence that we remain in our hotel until nightfall almost made me feel excited. A secret weapon, perhaps? Something so secret we should keep it from our own people? In a way, my prediction, God help me, proved true. At around midnight, we departed from the Steigenberger Conti towards a decidedly urban district. The carriage, rocking forward and backwards from the uneven paving, took us past what had previously been a Catholic school, now a dilapidated ruin. One could see the gate still creaking in the wind, its caretakers likely swallowed up by our efforts to end the sectarianism half a decade before. Tirpitz made some awful joke about seasickness and I declined to laugh, just to spite him. We eventually arrived at wherever the hell we were meant to be. A sham, rather than a house, clay roof tiles slipping down from the angle to clatter into the street. I had a good mind to turn back and ask that we return. He had finally felt sufficiently comfortable with me to tell me what it was that we were here to see. He told me, breath misting in front of his mouth, that this was his inspiration. I demanded he end his cryptic nonsense, and he finally came out with it. A clairvoyant. Tirpitz and I, greatcoat collars obscuring our faces, went straight in. What business a good Christian man had with a psychic, I hadn't the faintest idea. The court in Berlin had taken a bit of innocent fascination with astrologers, but to an extent that had been for the women, to ease their minds in the course of childbearing. We would all nod and adjourn for cigars in another room, and laugh and joke that soon enough, the whole heavens would soon descend and make residence in the palace. With enough brandy, one might attempt to lean out a window and beckon it down himself. One might think that a deep confidant of the nation's Minister for Naval Expenditures might live in somewhere, say, less hovel-like. One would be wrong. Inside was worse than a camp of gypsies. It didn't seem inhabited, but for a candlelight from the stairwell. We ascended carefully, lest the rotting wood collapse beneath us, and came before a great oak door. He knocked rhythmically. There wasn't any audible response, but a warm yellow light dripped out from below the door jamb. He opened the door and rushed in ahead of me, which I had never seen someone do when I was around, at least not when I was meant to follow them. Inside was more of the same as the lower level. Now well illuminated, the moulding plaster and stink of rotting wood became ever more apparent. It was a small room, a library, subject to a terrible lack of books, whose bare shelved walls gave an eerie impression of emptiness. Within was a desk, in a similar terrible state, a lantern on the desk which seemed to provide us the signal to enter, and 2 chairs before it. Tirpitz pushed past me and sat in the left-hand one and quickly gestured for me to take the parallel seat. Behind the desk was a shadow. One might think it a man in a black cloak at first, thin and small-framed, with the cloak sleeves tucked into the folds. No hands or face. I thought it beneath my dignity to stoop below and check for feet. Tirpitz produced from his coat a small journal and a pencil. I took my seat and felt the unsanded grain chafe against my trousers. Uncomfortable, but an old officer's school joke resounded in my head. Why stand when you can sit? There we sat, and then it spoke. A woman's voice, foreign but comprehensible.
Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. In the white tiger, the sun will spit a living flame, and the golden horns of the blood will roll down from the throne, down from the heavens they will walk across the bifrost set to, the pulling and gnashing and snarling and crushing, but not before the crush of man on and in the earth.
It turned to Tirpitz, who seemed almost giddy. I could see him sweat a bit, despite the cool evening breeze, and I joined him.
The wolves will be let into the sea, and you will be the houndmaster. Below they bark and claw at the guts of the farmer, and the miner, and the worker, and the nursemaid. The choke of the continent amidst the lion's tendrils. Your sons will yearn for the scraps of corn. Your daughters will make a feast of crows, and you will be made for vultures.
It turned to me, and I felt like a shard of glass had begun to dig into my scalp.
The withered sun walks the edge of the layer never enough, and never again. He bids the eagle's flight to combat the bear and the cock and the lion amidst wings of tapered cloth, thrust towards the abyss by the pounding of metal and raking the ground with her talons.
I felt a warm drip from my right ear. I smelled the blood, but I couldn't turn away.
You will watch the grinding and the crushing. You will see it all and do nothing. You will be fettered to a corpse and be unable to break the binding chains. All the world above and below will know that you alone bear fault.
The lantern on the desk extinguished itself. My eyes began to adjust to the darkness and rubbed my hand past my ear. The white glove I had worn was now smeared with blood. I turned to Tirpitz, who still seemed as jubilant as ever, scribbling some last note in his little journal. I turned back to the desk and before us was an empty chair. I decided to yell, loudly. To my frustration, he ignored me before finishing his writing and turning back to me.
As I told you, she's fascinating, and I've never had to hear the same story twice.
It was a silent train ride back to Berlin the next day. Even now, I remember that night when I lie in my cot and dream, if I dreamed anymore. Now, since I've been down here, I've only had nightmares. I hadn't slept well for some time. When the call went out to the army for volunteers to fulfill the year's conscription requirements for 5th Corps, I was taking tea with the Austrian ambassador who had arrived several days before and had dispatched an entourage looking to secure sale of new fortress guns from Krupp. Krupp had held their exhibition for 3 years by then, and having missed the event last year, I was tempted to go, if not to watch the spectacle, then to just get out of the palace. The place had become suffocating, and watching this fellow, one of those perfumed Hungarian nobles, daintily slip cubes of sugar into his cup and blather on about something. I couldn't recall exactly. I don't think I cared enough to recall. A servant tapped me on the shoulder and handed me a note. It was a picture of some kind of animal, perhaps a dog. The stick limbs extending from a circular body wasn't masterful, but it was what I requested as an excuse to get away. I insisted that there had been an emergency meeting of the 5th Corps leadership regarding the provision of supplies, and let myself out. His perfumed, feminized excellency made great assurances to me that he understood and would like to finish his cup before departing. I determined that a nod was sufficient to acknowledge him. That servant got an advance on his pay for that little stunt. I don't recall authorizing it. Hopefully he received it. In any case, there was a pertinent need for me to leave the palace and go somewhere. A brisk walk towards the eastern wing to check in with Donna yielded nothing of interest. The children were asleep, and she had some pressing engagement with the ladies of the court to see some rendition of Das Rheingold. Of all the operatics, Wagner seemed to touch her heart more than most. Her activities kept her content and kept her away from Mother. The spats between the two of them gave occasion for the skin to crawl. Returning to my office, leaning past the marble pillar in the hallway, I watched the Hungarian fop make his way out towards whatever unfortunate hotel had taken his reservation. Sitting down again at my desk and beckoning the help to open the windows and doors to draw out the flowery stench of my previous guest, it became obvious there was nothing for it. A hunting trip. Excellent. I've got the time. I should go find that cause to call on Tirpitz. He was the worst shot in the Admiralty, and an easy mark for wages over marksmanship. That antelope in Bohemia that lost our party several months ago could surely be mine now. Walking towards the door, I was met with another pair of legs coming around the corner, and nearly collided with them. That servant returned, and I assumed that he had intended to crack some kind of joke, but instead handed me yet another paper. I tried to instruct him to dispose of it, lest we be caught prematurely jettisoning an important diplomatic figure, but he looked at me and said those 5 terrible words.
"This one is real, sir."
The divisional commanders insisted that we convene to actually discuss matters of provisions. One of the many wonders introduced to the palace and the academy was the new electric carriage system. Naturally, this became a fixation of mine, as I hadn't the opportunity to board the thing. You could easily see it from the windows in the west wing, slowly sliding along the track, and could hear it when the conductor got into some duel of words with pedestrians standing in its path. This new mission finally gave me cause to use it. I never cared for crowds. I know that royalty tends to accumulate them, but that thought was never sufficient consolation for their stares and their noise. One formed on the platform while I waited. Waves and smiles from the passers-by were returned, but those god-awful cameras, the incessant chasing of their subjects by their operators. Stay quite still, sir. No smiles, please, sir. Could you lean a bit to the left, sir? Madness. The tram finally arrived, and the doors clattered open, disgorging the human cargo that flowed past me. I boarded and asked the conductor to close the door behind me. It was late enough in the afternoon that no regular commuters would be inconvenienced, but I saw the expression of reluctance in the corners of his mouth. It was slow, very slow. Slow to the point where you could look through the glass and be passed by a horse carriage. The conductor began to instruct me on its scientific merits. Surely a great breakthrough, and so on. I leaned over to sit down, and my glove caught something sticky. Someone must have disposed of their chewing gum under the parcel shelf. Worse than chewing tobacco, that stuff, and certainly harder to remove from good cloth. I took the glove off, folded it, and stuffed it into my pocket. The laundress would surely pitch a fit, but I was more concerned with coming into contact with any more of these unkempt surfaces. The journey came to an end abruptly. A mark of efficiency, that thing. It had transformed a leisurely 10-minute walk into a 22-minute disgusting rendezvous with the bacteria of the public. The academy beckoned a bit further down the street, and I elected to open the door here and not wait for the conductor to resolve the jam in the handbrake. It will be a doomed city that relies on transport like that to move persons and goods. They knew I was coming, surely. The doors opened. A Spartan building with a Spartan purpose. Most of the younger officers had already left the lecture halls and now moved to gallivant about the town. Past the last hallway, and below that crystal chandelier that we used to throw spare coat buttons at in our hours of boredom, was the conference hall. I could hear the conversations already ongoing. Why would they start without me? What had I already missed?
Thankfully, Krupp has decided to cover most of the costs of retrofitting the carriages. The Abteilung reports that the conditions aren't so bad as to necessitate reliance on horse-drawn options. The lease terms include further use for continued supply for 2 years.
Gentlemen. The door behind me closed and a great gasp of air flowed past me. The medals hanging from the elder Moltke's coat swayed and clicked against one another in the silence. The man was over 80 years old and still rode his own horse and attended meetings of the general staff.
Good of you to join us, my prince. We had just begun the discussion. The seat at the head of the table is yours.
Across the gold-edged mahogany of the conference table was splayed a plethora of maps and charts. As I walked towards my seat, I recognized most of them. French fortifications along our mutual border, rail lines leading from Bayern and Prussia that terminated in the Saarland, attendance counts for the year's conscription intake. Moving closer to my seat were more fantastical maps, land masses and oceans that I didn't recognize, blank spots on the corners. The markers for French and English units that we had used for years during war games were spread across them, and more improvised tokens, not more than scraps of paper scribbled on with colored ink. Russia, Italy, Austria, United States, Turks, Japanese, etc. Atlantean, Atlan, Lemuria. I took my seat and continued to take in the deluge of information. The younger Moltke finished his statement and began a repartee with Tirpitz.
The lease provides for supply traffic through the tower for the next 2 years. Its use shouldn't be necessary for more than 9 months, by our projections. Connecting the new settlements to our primary access through Italy should be completed before next winter. The contractors for rail construction have widened the Munich-Verona line to double track. The negotiation of the lease has made it unnecessary to widen the platforms by more than 50 meters.
Do you have a timetable?
Less than 2 weeks from set-off at the end of the month.
That's what? 800 train cars over 2 weeks? You need 3 axles passing every half hour.
Gentlemen, what are we doing here? Never enjoying being left out, I felt compelled to ask the question.
A new colonial venture. Africa and Arabia were mere walks in the park by comparison.
Below, then, what do we have planned? The exasperation on the younger Moltke's face was palpable. My tardiness from the use of the tram must have caused me to miss the initial briefing. He couldn't rightly snub me, but gave a haphazard summary of the discussion that I had missed. An opportunity for permanent acquisitions within the inner earth had presented itself, and we would take it and hold it with both hands. I knew about the lease already, but had assumed that our use would be scientific and exploratory. Did the Chancellor knowingly approve this expedition's request for funding?
He did, partially.
Partially approved or partially knowing?
It's immaterial, my prince. The remainder of the funding was offered by private interests.
Our army isn't a band of sellswords.
Those interests did not condition their offer. Fifth Corps will have total authority, and its new leader ought to make himself knowledgeable regarding the conditions of the mission.
Who have you appointed for this fool's endeavor? The rest of the room looked silently towards me. The answer to my question became obvious as the words left my mouth.
Have our telegrams not been making it to your office?
Use respect when addressing me, Moltke. I didn't mean to snap at him, but he looked down from my eyes. I forced a smile, and he continued his briefing. Fifth Corps would load onto rail carriages and depart for the Saarland in 1 week's time. 2 weeks could be allowed for the transit from the Saar to Orléans. French conditions included that the military travel in sealed cars and not reroute from the line under any circumstances absent a derailment. From the city of Orléans, the formation would load onto the freight elevator and descend into the earth. Simple enough of a maneuver for us, I suppose. Once assembled on the terminal end, we would march from Paris and bivouac outside of the city. Moltke held up a map of what I assumed was sunken Paris and its surroundings, and brought his sabre to rest against the road from the city that ran along a sizable body of water. To a rough circle superimposed over the coastal landscape, the label, the name of our prospective colony, was penned inside the circle. Not exactly the perfect contours that a cartographer or surveyor might make, but it conveyed the idea. I wondered what astronomical sum we would have to tender to the French to acquire this lease, but contemplating the idea would only bring consternation. A greater issue presented itself to me, and I felt compelled to interject. You have 9 months of supplies. If your progress is delayed, will you barter with the English or the French for provisions?
Delays have been accounted for. Commander Tirpitz has provided a solution by which we will be resupplied by water.
You leased this elevator, and you leased the Icelandic canals. Is there any money left to pay the men? Tirpitz had one of those terrible smiles come across his face.
We don't need a lease from the English. We just need their waterborne traffic to continue.
You're paying for them to transport our supplies?
We aren't paying them at all. We are moving with them without them knowing.
Moltke relinquished his control of the briefing and gestured for Tirpitz to take the fore. I was engaged a bit more now, knowing that this might finally be interesting.
Experimental trials have demonstrated the efficiency of our submersible vehicles. This is our lifeline, fellows.
Tirpitz produced a blueprint of a strange-looking seacraft. A long, slim thing. Looked like a series of sewer pipes welded together.
This is U-1, the Unterseeboot, towed into launch position by vessels of an appropriate tonnage. It carries a crew of 18 and can maneuver 50 meters below the surface, carrying 12 tons of supplies. The depth of the Icelandic canals is sufficient to permit our vessels to travel underneath English ships, and our intelligence services have provided the shipping schedules used by the Royal Navy.
If they find what you're about, what is your plan then?
If possible, using the excuse of naval exercises, keeping a task force near the area will provide plausibility. In more difficult circumstances, a torpedo.
You've lost your mind. You want to fire on English ships under our colours? You want to stake the survival of a colony on experiments? This is absurd. What madness has convinced you that this will work?
It already has. How do you think that these maps were created? Our assets have been below for the last 4 years. Infiltration and extraction missions have been successful every 8 out of 10 attempts.
And the other two?
Unfortunate circumstances, but in both cases the vessels were retrieved.
The headache that had been brewing on the tram started in earnest. I gave him my final response. What is your contingency in the event that supply by water is impossible?
That is something I will hand to our esteemed guest from the Krupp firm.
I hadn't even noticed this creature in the room. Slim man, white laboratory coat standing out amidst all of the officers' uniforms, horn-rimmed spectacles framing a sharp face.
It is our pleasure to provide this government with a solution to this new venture. Is it not Germany's prerogative to seek the same glory as the remaining powers? It is our belief that strong cooperation between this endeavor and our interest will be to our mutual benefit. It will be by German efficiency in industry that this endeavor will.
Save the puffery. This isn't the Reichstag. Get to your point and explain your offering.
As you like, General Moltke.
The man produced a series of diagrams that looked more like the sketches of a madman on asylum walls than a business proposal. The primary feature seemed to be the spiral staircase-looking mechanism for lifting large cargo. Further maps, seemingly more detailed than the ones on the table, placed a junction between the proposed location of our new colony to a confluence of rail lines on the layer below. Propulsion to be provided by reciprocating petroleum engines manufactured by Krupp. The barrage of questions regarding timeliness and material costs seemed to be all answered promptly and appropriately. The man didn't sweat at the interrogation.
Well then, it seems to all be in order. Any further inquiries can be directed to our Essen office.
I don't think you're getting away that easily. No, I want you there, Mr.
Diesel. Rudolf Diesel, Your Majesty.
You'll be joining us then, I think. The use of a scientific mind in this effort will be inevitably necessary. He looked nervous, but voiced no objection. He sat back down, looking defeated. The younger Moltke rose again.
I think then that all is in order. I'll have command begin issuing the assembly orders and requisitioning rail carriages. We will be in contact with all of you regarding progress. Best of luck to our commander and his new adjutant.
The rest of them rose and applauded. Diesel, the elder Moltke, and I remained seated. While the officers shuffled from the room, the nephew helped his uncle up from his seat, and I approached our newest recruit. The evening began to close in on us, and the newfangled electric lighting came to life as we left the academy building. Have you ever been on safari, Mr. Diesel?
No, sir.
Well, the first one is always the most fun. I'm sure this will be enlightening for you.
I should like to pick your mind, sir, as to what you know about the inner earth.
Right now?
Unless His Majesty has some other preoccupation, in which case I understand, and will have telegraphic correspondence to follow to that end.
I pondered the options. Dona is at the opera. The staff have the children, who are likely terrorizing them. Father and mother are likely asleep. The citizens have returned home. There was nothing on the agenda. Why not? The fellow didn't seem comfortable in his own skin. The way he walked was indicative of a man with a millstone around his neck. I feared that I had put it there, but I was unwilling to take the risk associated with the new venture bearing the weight of business interests without some representative of said interest. Krupp was our man and our firm. Our walk down the Linden came to a fairly deserted public house. The girl sweeping the patio looked like she had seen 2 ghastly spirits and ran calling for her father, the presumed proprietor. He sat us down at a table next to the window and insisted that we were welcome, despite the indications that they had intended to close up shop less than 10 minutes prior. He served us a licorice digestive, and my companion asked for wine instead. We sat and sipped slowly until he worked up the courage to talk to me.
I should let His Majesty know that I was a Catholic, and have spent much time in France.
Now that was interesting. I don't hold it against you. Difficult times these last couple of years. You weren't involved with the insurgency then.
If I was, I wouldn't be here pitching woo to generals. I'd be up in Spandau.
Quite right. You said was. Are you no longer a papist?
I've taken a non-denominational belief to heart.
You have that right under our law. You were born in France then, Paris.
Yes. I avoided the Parisian disaster during my tenure at the Bavarian Technical University. I lost my parents to the sinking.
You have my condolences, Herr Diesel. The silence gripped us for a moment. You wanted to discuss with me the intricacies of the depths. You have my attention. He sighed and beckoned the waitress for another drink. I followed suit.
There are things in this world, literally inside of it, that prove difficult for men of science to understand.
I've heard the myths and the legends. Great armored men riding lizards, flying insectoid monstrosities, ancient civilizations and black magic.
It's largely true.
How would you know? Have you been below?
Not myself directly. Our firm funded the placement of spies. They report to Alfred and he reports it to His Majesty's grandfather and the Chancellor.
I don't like being kept in the dark. When we go down together, your mind must be open to the men and myself.
If you don't like being kept in the dark, sir, you should not have accepted this appointment. That's all there is down there, the dark.
The electric lighting on the streets gave our little meeting a shimmering reflection in the window. I looked out, and that tram continued shuffling down towards the city's center. Conductor must have figured the problem out. After a third drink, I could feel the beverage's warmth beginning to embrace me. I asked the critical question. Do you think that we will succeed?
Of course, sir. Nothing complicated regarding the logistics or construction.
But you're holding out on me, Herr Diesel. Outside and among the presence of officers, I am your nation's royalty, but seated here we are two men. Speak what troubles you.
It's not mechanically difficult, it's psychologically difficult. The darkness is something that one can get used to after a period. But there is a condition that men seem to suffer when they descend. A paranoia. A belief that other men around him are depriving him of the truth. A belief that a new danger lurks behind every rock and bush. A belief that he might never see the surface and his loved ones again. There's a reason we have rotated our assets below on regular intervals. The great irony of it all is that when the call goes out to return, some resist it. They say they've adjusted to the pressures below, and yearn to continue work long beyond the reasonable time of contract. The trouble isn't logistical. It isn't that horrifying descent into the bowels of the earth.
He finished his full glass in a single swallow.
The trouble with it is simple. The trouble is letting go.